the war in Ukraine was a totally different war from what we've seen so far in the aftermath of the World War II, because for the first time, two superpowers are confronting each other in Ukraine. How China perceived this, how does it contribute to de-dollarization, in your opinion?
Well, de-dollarization was going to happen one way or another because of two factors. One is something that's been there all along. Why should countries around the world lend money to the United States continuously in order to fuel American consumption if they don't have to? And the other part of it is, well, they used to have to because the United States was very powerful. But now that it's quite weak, they can escape. They can make their own way and their own arrangements, which they're busy doing. So now Russia and China, for instance, they don't use the US dollar in trade. They use their own currencies. And as far as the war, well, basically it wasn't really a war. It was a special military operation. Um, and the function of the operation so far was to gain some territory for Russia, which was Russian territory to begin with, and to prove that the United States is militarily toothless, along with the European Union. That NATO is basically a paper tiger that can't fight, and that there will be peace because nobody wants a nuclear war, and that peace will be on Russia's terms. So that's basically what China saw and observed. It never joined the sanctions bandwagon against Russia. It continued to trade with Russia. Now, Chinese trade with Russia is on the order of $200 billion a year, which is quite a lot, and growing very nicely. And it's not going to back away from Russia. It's not going to join this anti-Russian bandwagon no matter what. If there is some kind of an kinetic action against China having to do with Taiwan, Russia will do the same. It will stand by China. And so the idea that the United States and its various allies, who together do not amount to very much at all militarily at this point, the idea that they could overcome the combination of Russia and China acting as a unit is outlandish. It's not going to happen.
Since this war started, what were the most challenging elements of the Russian economy?
The main challenge that the Russian economy had was that it was managed by people who have been trained within the European system, within the European and American mindset. They were basically Western agents, whether they realized it or not. So they thought that it was proper for Russia to have foreign currency reserves in dollars and euros in banks in the West. They thought that that was a reasonable approach. They thought that relying on the SWIFT interbank system for payments was reasonable. They thought that having all sorts of strategic import dependencies on Western countries and on the United States was quite reasonable, that it was okay to use Microsoft software in government and even in defense was thinkable somehow. Well, the West and the United States luckily changed all that. The sanctions and the cutting Russia off from SWIFT and the freezing of Russian foreign reserves, those were all big, huge presents that the West made to Russia. It couldn't have done a better job in making the Russians realize what they have to do to become self-sufficient and not reliant on on hostile foreign countries, which they have done. So now Russia has a far more successful um, economic system that basically mandates a level of self-reliance. It's growing economically and not through an expansion of debt, as in the case of the United States, which basically always borrows enough in order to simulate economic growth. Russia is actually investing its earnings instead of sinking what it makes into worthless United States government paper. It invests that money in building factories, building roads, building schools, hospitals. There's a huge construction boom happening in Russia. All of that happened just because the West eliminated itself from the Russian economy. That was just a wonderful present, and it should keep going like that forever.
When you look at Ukraine right now, are they going to continue supporting Ukraine? Are they going to just leave Ukraine as they did in Iraq, in Afghanistan? How do you find this?
Oh, they're already basically abandoning the Ukrainians. They basically abandon everyone. The United States, which is in control of the whole thing, the Europeans decide absolutely nothing. But the United States always fights wars until they stop being profitable. So they've reached that point with the Ukraine. They've basically they've used up all of their old armaments, which they sold at face value, even though most of that stuff was just junk, ready to be scrapped. So that was profitable. They got rid of all of the ordnance that was past its use-by date. A lot of it didn't explode. A lot of other worn-out stuff that got shipped there and was claimed as revenue by defense contractors. But now they actually have to make stuff, and they have to make stuff in huge quantities in order to continue to supply the Ukraine, and that is just not profitable for them. They would rather make token efforts and charge a lot for them than make huge efforts and make them reasonably priced in order to be able to sustain them. So they're just not going to do that. And what happens to the Ukrainians as a result of that is of no interest to them whatsoever. It was never of any interest to them. The Ukrainians are just cannon fodder as far as the Americans are concerned. It was never anything different.
Ukrainian foreign minister said that Europe doesn't know how to fight. This means that Europe is not doing what they're asking for, or they stopped doing at the level that they have been doing during this conflict. What else Europe can do for Ukraine in terms of their economy, in terms of ammunition? Is there anything else that Europe can do for Ukraine?
I don't think Europe can do anything at all for Ukraine. What you quoted is, I think it's Kuleba who said that. Well, the stuff that comes out of his mouth, you feel free to listen to him, but I don't particularly bother. I suppose he makes a really obvious point, which is that NATO, in terms of numbers, looks reasonable, but if you dig, what could they do at the Eastern Front if it came to that? And the answer is probably a couple of weeks worth of token effort, and after that, the Russians would basically, run over them, and that would be it. There's really nothing that they can do militarily to Russia, and it turns out that they no longer can do anything to Russia economically or politically. So yes, the Europeans they can't fight, they can't do anything, they can't stand up for themselves. They can't even elect a government that will pay attention to the European countries, individual European countries' national interests. They're pretty much powerless. So I suppose he's right as far as that goes.
Ukraine is that important for the United States to sacrifice Europe to go after a conflict of nuclear bombs. Is that possible?
No, it's not possible. I don't think that there's any possibility of a nuclear confrontation, barring some really extravagant accident. And you have to keep in mind that most of the money that's spent on nuclear weapons is spent on making sure that they're never used. Because nuclear weapons are deterrence weapons. They're deterrent. They're not meant to be used. And that's one of the things that very few people realize about nuclear weapons is that if at any point you use a nuclear weapon, you lose by so doing. It's not a weapon to use. It's a weapon to force others not to use nuclear weapons. That's all it's for. And as it stands, the nuclear arsenal of the United States is kind of old, but that doesn't matter because it'll never be used. And the nuclear arsenal of Russia is quite new and can be deployed in ways that the United States can't really do anything about. Hypersonic rockets that the Americans can't shoot down. They don't really have an air defense system at all. All they have is, the Patriot batteries, which, again, the Ukrainians showed don't work, and before that, the Saudis showed that they don't work. None of that stuff works. So what the Americans are going to do is make sure that nuclear weapons are not used under any circumstance.
Just recently, Putin tried to cut a deal between Armenia and Azerbaijan. China, together with Russia, tried to solve the problems between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They're good right now. They're getting better. When it comes to the US, it seems as a superpower, they're not doing what everybody would expect. In Ukraine, they could have simply solved the problems by negotiating with Russia. We know that. What's going on in Gaza? It's another example that the US foreign policy doesn't work the way it should.
Well, the United States basically doesn't really have, anything that amounts to a strategy. Basically, they have inertia built into the system. They cannot change the narrative. They have to pursue the containment narrative with regard to both China and Russia. They can't abandon it, even if containment has already failed. They have to act as if they're indispensable and powerful, even if they've been dispensed with by everyone and are no longer powerful. Because the alternative really is just complete dysfunction, even greater dysfunction within the political system, within the United States. And it's unavoidable, but they're trying to collapse politically in slow motion as opposed to all at once. I don't know whether that strategy will last the entire year. Maybe it'll last a few more months. The biggest problem is that they have to borrow something like $1.5 trillion a year just to keep the federal government operating. And it doesn't seem like they'll be able to keep up the borrowing rate, given that everybody is de-dollarizing as quickly as they can. And that'll be pretty much the end for the federal government. If the federal government is shut down, then there is no federal government. If it stays shut down for a few months, everybody will forget that it ever existed. It'll never come back. So that's really what the United States is looking at. But what the rest of the world is doing, and Russia in particular, is waiting the United States out, because once the United States collapses into civil war, which is being talked about constantly, but nothing is being done about it. But once that civil war starts, and it will probably start the moment the federal government shut down for good, the rest of the world won't have to worry about the United States very much. It'll just be a non-problem for the rest of the world. It'll be a bit of a problem for China, which still directs quite a bit of trade towards the United States, but it's only something like 10% of its total trade, so it can take that hit and survive. There'll be some distortions around the world, but the biggest ones will probably affect Europe and perhaps China as well, although China has management in place to manage such a crisis, whereas Europe doesn't. But that's what everybody's waiting for. When Putin decided to start the special military operation in the Ukraine, I'm sure that he basically knew that it was time limited by the continued existence of the United States. I'm sure that that was part of his calculus, that a few years down the road, Russia will make some gains. Russian military will once again be the most powerful in the world. And shortly thereafter, the United States will no longer be a force to be reckoned with. I'm sure that's what he had in mind.
The relations between Russia and the United States before this war started, it wasn't that good, but it was functioning. Is that possible that through negotiations in Ukraine, we can get to the point that they were before this war started?
Zero chance of that. One thing you can always count on with the Russians is that their first offer is always the best. Now, what will happen is that the situation will get resolved. It will get resolved on Russia's terms. Russia will basically declare what it wants, and it'll get it because nobody can stand up to Russia. And that's what we're looking for. Now, the fact is Russia is not in any hurry because it has to rebuild the Ukraine. The place has been mismanaged completely mismanaged for 30 years. And most of the infrastructure there is 50 years old or so. It needs to be rebuilt. Now, Russia is already busy rebuilding Lugansk and Donetsk and Zaporozhye and Kherson. So how many Ukrainian regions can Russia rebuild in a year? Well, maybe one or two, but what it would probably prefer is that the Americans and the Europeans somehow subsidize this effort by basically taking care of the Ukrainian population in some way, while Russia is busy absorbing it one region at a time. That would be the best plan as far as Russia is concerned. It doesn't really want the United States to cut and run and pretend that the Ukraine doesn't exist. So it is within Russia's interest to make the Ukraine as politically embarrassing for the United States as possible, so that cutting and running away from the Ukraine would look like such a staggeringly huge defeat that the Americans wouldn't even think of doing it. The United States should stay mired in the Ukraine for as long as Russia wants that.
Their long-term strategy would be supporting Israel the way they're doing right now, or they're gonna cut the support and they're gonna find some sort of settlement, political settlement in Gaza. Maybe Ukraine is just, the case is dead. They can't do anything about Ukraine, but they would focus on Taiwan.
It's very hard to tell what they're going to do. I think that they're basically going to be resource limited in all three places. In China, because they cannot cut off China's trade with the United States. There are too many spare parts and too much strategic material coming from China to the United States. They can't even consider cutting that off. And China could survive cutting it off, but the United States cannot survive without China at this point. The Chinese made themselves made the United States addicted to China. In various ways, including Chinese-made fentanyl. So basically, they'll slow walk the conflict with China because they can't really go at it without ruining themselves rather quickly, within weeks. With the Ukraine, as I mentioned, just basically abandoning it altogether would be too big an embarrassment. It would be Afghanistan times 10. And as far as Gaza and Israel, well, Israel is starting to evaporate. I don't know how many people realize it, but 500,000 Israelis have fled the country since the beginning of the conflict. 500,000. That's a very large number. Incidentally, that's the same as the number of Ukrainians who decide to become Russian and arrive in Moscow and are processed and eventually get Russian citizenship, become indistinguishable from the general population. These are very large flows of people, but the Ukraine can basically lose people at this rate for a few years. Israel can lose people at this rate for maybe a year, but in a year, Israel, if it keeps going at this rate, Israel will be basically gone. It'll evaporate. It'll be renamed Palestine again. So the United States needs to basically somehow contribute to that process without hugely angering their very large pro-Israeli lobby, which consists of both the Jews who are on the Democratic side and these Christian Zionists who are thinking in terms of Armageddon and are thinking that their plan to herd all the Jews into Israel and start an Armageddon to trigger Christ's second coming is sort of not working out very well, so they'd be upset about that as well. And the other thing is that basically Israel owns about half of the U.S. Congress in the United States, and so they will lobby whatever they need to lobby within limits, within what the United States can actually provide. But this conflict can go on for as long as Israel is still an entity on the political map for however many years of life it has left in it.
If something happened in Taiwan with all these three conflicts, how do you see the problems that would appear in Europe?
Well, an amazing thing just happened. If you noticed, with the closing of the Suez Canal by the Yemenis. The Yemenis are very much aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is supported by Turkey, and the Palestinians, the Hamas are also part of or aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. They all have very similar ideas of a just outcome. And so they managed with very little invested to stop ship traffic going through the Suez, because basically they created a force majeure, which forced cancellation of insurance policies on international shipping. And basically no ship can now sail to Israel, and no Israeli-owned ship can sail through the Suez Canal because they don't have insurance. Instead, they have to sail around the Cape of Good Hope, which adds 2 weeks and a giant expense, and also a delay. So European industry, which was already in very rough shape, is now going to be looking at a few weeks worth of shutdowns, forced shutdowns, because they'll be missing parts for various assembly tasks that need just-in-time delivery of components, and that of course will drive will drive deindustrialization in Western Europe to a higher speed than it was already happening because of the loss of Russian energy. None of that is good for either the United States or the West. And I think that the United States is going to become increasingly constrained in its ability to act in the world. So I think what's going to be happening is the United States is going to be increasingly constrained in what it can do in the world. All of these conflicts are too much for it already, and making them even bigger is definitely not something that it can even consider doing. I think instead it's going to be focusing inward on its many huge problems verging on civil war, and that's going to preoccupy it much more than any part of foreign policy.
Do you think at the end of the day, the public opinion in the West, in the world, gonna take these people, these medias accountable for what they've been doing during this conflict in Ukraine?
Oh no, never, 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 never. The media is basically doing a specific job that it was hired to do. Did it do such a good job on the coronavirus scare? Did it actually tell the truth about the coronavirus? You know, did it actually tell the truth about what was going on in Afghanistan all those years, or was it lying the entire time? Was the whole Osama bin Laden assassination, was that actual news coverage, or was that some some narrative handed down by the CIA? I could go on and on. But basically, Western media is basically they're a bunch of puppeteers. They don't they don't actually uh, uh, in any way convey the news. They convey narratives that are approved narratives, and so there is no accounting built into the system, none whatsoever. What will happen is that more people in the West will wise up than already have, and will begin to completely disregard the mainstream media. You know, that's already happening, and that's why people are watching you and me. You know, that's why we have an audience. It's because, you know, mainstream media is just not really worth paying attention to at all.
Right now, when you look at Gaza, it seems that they're trying to push these people out of Gaza. They want to conquer Gaza in totality. In your opinion, this policy would work for Israel?
You have to keep in mind that a large number of Muslim countries, with some notable exceptions, uh, doesn't really um, doesn't really control uh, their own foreign policies. Basically, they have these elites that have been thrust upon them in order to integrate them into a Western political scheme, and they can ignore the Arab street for very long periods of time. Now, they also have repressive apparatus at their disposal that makes public unrest very difficult to borderline impossible in terms of actually changing the way those governments operate. But what's happening now is that the United States and Israel are beginning to look rather pale and weak. And so the governments in question are wondering whether they should perhaps change their policy correspondingly. And big shifts such as Saudi Arabia selling oil for yuan instead of dollars, Saudi Arabia establishing diplomatic relations with Iran, with Tehran, various other shifts like that would indicate that these Arab regimes are also looking um, for looking to make certain changes. And the other component of it is that the Arab street has moved to Europe and the United States. The number of refugees or migrants or whatever you want to call them, transplants um, from the Middle East and from Muslim countries to the United States and to Europe has been so large that they are on the verge of having a major influence on European and American politics. And this is not something that is to Israel's advantage. So Israel may own half of U.S. Congress, but if the U.S. Congress can't really borrow money fast enough to help itself and Israel, and if there's pressure from voters to vote against Israel's interests and to try to save the lives of Palestinians, then that changes the picture politically, not in favor of Israel at all. And so we will probably see that unfolding for the rest of this year and for as long as Israel lasts.
How do you see the future of Democratic Party? Because they don't accept people like RFK Jr., Bobby Kennedy. They don't accept the left part of the party, which is Cornel West.
Well, I think that the Democratic Party is not a party. It's and it's not my opinion. You can look it up, and it's a fact. It's a nonprofit corporation. It's a private corporation. It's not a public entity, and it's closely held by a small group of insiders. They're the ones who basically picked Joe Biden and stuck him in the White House for 4 years, knowing that he would decide nothing. Interestingly, most of Biden's cabinet, which he didn't pick, it was picked for him, is Jewish and very much aligned with Israel, and that's not really helping either. So basically, it's the Obamas and the Clintonites and various other people who have so many skeletons in the closet. It's not even funny. They've killed so many people over the years that if all of those cases were actually investigated, the entire top of the quote unquote Democratic Party would be in jail for life. And so these people are fighting for their lives. They can't really afford to lose power. The United States has become one of these banana republics where if a government gets replaced, then it goes to jail, and all of the laws get tossed, and basically the country starts over. So that's the state of U.S. politics right now. The Democratic Party cannot allow any actual democratic process to occur, to happen. It cannot allow the voice of the people to be heard, never mind taken into account. And if it loses, then it loses everything. It's a very high stakes game for them.
People like John Mearsheimer, he always says that the peer competitor of the US would be China. The way that the United States is fighting Russia, Russia would be able to be some sort of balance between these two powers.
I think Russia and China are melding. So distinguishing them in terms of U.S. foreign policy is not reasonable. If you're talking to China, you're also talking to Russia and vice versa. A deal that you make with Russia is also a deal that you would end up making with China at the same time. And they're very slow to realize that. They're extremely slow to realize that. I don't know whether it's even worth pursuing in terms of rectifying their thinking on this score. But the bottom line is they won't be able to do anything. As far as China is concerned, the United States is basically a country that buys its products and sort of meddles in annoying ways that, as with Russia, is helping China fill strategic gaps, such as um, lithography equipment for chip making, which is a hot item right now. Um, but but basically, China will sell goods to whoever wants to buy them. And as far as Russia is concerned, the United States is an enemy. It's the country that Russia is fighting in the Ukraine. Russia is not fighting a war against the Ukraine, which, as far as Russia is concerned, doesn't even exist. It's a bunch of Russian lands that are under foreign management at the moment, and that's something to be rectified. But who is the enemy in the Ukraine? It's obviously not the Ukrainians, because there's no difference between the Russians and the Ukrainians. They're one people, as far as the Russians are concerned. The enemy is the United States. So why would Russia decide to make deals with its enemy? I don't think it would.